In Jerusalem, that Sabbath was no ordinary Sabbath. It was the strangest Sabbath the city had ever known, a day suspended between two worlds, between a death that had shaken the earth and a morning no one could yet imagine. The streets were still, the markets closed, the homes sealed by the law of rest, and yet something in the air was not the usual silence of the seventh day. It was another kind of silence. A silence that weighed heavily, that asked questions, that found no answer in any of the sacred texts the scribes had memorized since childhood. Because no one in Jerusalem, not the high priest in his palace, nor the closest disciple in his hiding place, had categories for what had just happened. The day before, a man had died whom many called the Son of God. And now the Sabbath fell over that death like a slab of stone, forcing everyone to remain still with what they could not understand. To grasp what that Sabbath was, you first have to understand what the Sabbath meant in the life of a first-century Jew. It was not simply a day off, not a pause in work, not what modern times call rest. The Sabbath was a living theological institution, a weekly declaration that God had created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, and that his people, by imitating that rest, aligned themselves with the eternal rhythm of the universe. The book of Genesis establishes it in its opening pages with a solemnity that leaves no room for negotiation. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day God finished the work he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work he had created and made. Genesis 2 verses 1-3. For the Jew of the first century, those words were not a relic of a distant past. They were the very constitution of time itself. Every Sabbath was a renewal of that original moment, a participation in God's rest, an affirmation that creation had a creator and that this creator was faithful. The Sabbath in Jerusalem began at the precise moment the sun set on Friday afternoon, when the priests in the temple would sound the shofar from the top of the wall to announce to the entire city that sacred time had begun. That sound would travel through the narrow streets of the lower quarters, climb the slopes of Mount Zion, reach the homes of the priestly district, and filter into every house where a woman lit the Sabbath lamps and spoke the blessing over the light. In that instant, everything stopped. Shops closed, workshops fell silent, journeys were interrupted. Rabbinic law had, over the centuries, developed an extremely detailed system of restrictions that defined with near mathematical precision what was allowed and what was not during the next 24 hours. One could not carry a weight greater than a dried figure. One could not write more than 2 letters. One could neither kindle a fire nor extinguish one. One could not walk more than 2,000 cubits, about 900 meters, beyond the city limits. These restrictions were not experienced as a burden by devout Jews, but as a privilege, as the outward sign of an inward covenant with the God who had set Israel apart from all nations precisely through the Sabbath. And yet, that particular Sabbath, the Sabbath of the 14th of Nisan in the year 33 of our era, carried a weight that no rabbinic law had ever anticipated. Because the day before, a Friday that had begun as the ordinary preparation for the Sabbath, something had occurred that altered the axis on which the city turned. Jesus of Nazareth, the Galilean rabbi who had entered Jerusalem days earlier amid palm branches and cries of Hosanna, had been tried, condemned, and executed. And now his body lay in a new tomb, sealed with a great stone in a garden near the place of execution. His disciples were scattered, terrified, hiding behind closed doors in some corner of the city or in its outskirts. The women who had followed him from Galilee had seen where he was buried and had gone back to prepare aromatic spices, but the arrival of the Sabbath had stopped them completely. The Gospel of Luke records it with a brevity that contains an entire world. They returned and prepared spices and ointments, and rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. Luke 23 verse 56. That resting according to the commandment is one of the most moving details in the entire Gospel narrative. Even in their desolation, even with hearts shattered by what they had witnessed, the women kept the Sabbath. The law held that kind of power over the faithful Jewish heart. Pain did not excuse the commandment, and so, with the spices prepared and their hearts broken, they sat and waited. You have to imagine Jerusalem on that Sabbath with the greatest historical fidelity possible to understand the weight of what was unfolding. The city in the time of Jesus was a major religious metropolis in the ancient world, with a population that in normal days hovered around 100,000 inhabitants, but during pilgrimage festivals such as Passover could multiply several times over. Pilgrims from every region of the Roman Empire and beyond filled every available space, from inns in the commercial district to the courtyards of distant relatives' homes and the tents set up on the hills surrounding the city. The week of Passover was the climax of the Jewish religious calendar, the commemoration of the liberation from Egypt, the foundational event of Israel's national identity, and its celebration summoned every Jew who could make the journey. The temple, which dominated the northeastern skyline of the city from its vast artificial platform, was the heart around which everything revolved, the place where God's presence dwelled among his people, the sacred axis of the universe according to the Jewish worldview of the first century. That Sabbath, however, the temple carried something its priests could not name without unease. The previous day, at the exact moment Jesus breathed his last on the cross, the inner veil of the temple, that curtain of finely woven linen of extraordinary size that separated the holy place from the most holy place, had been torn from top to bottom. The Gospel of Matthew records it with precision. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. Matthew 27 verse 51. That tearing was not an accident, nor a private symbol. It was a cosmic sign. The most holy place was the space where, once a year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would enter alone with the blood of the sacrifice to make atonement for the entire people. It was the point of contact between the infinite holiness of God and sinful humanity. The divine presence, the Shekinah, dwelled between the cherubim of the mercy seat with such intensity that the high priest entered trembling, with bells on the hem of his garment, so that those outside would know he was still alive and moving. That torn veil meant that the system of mediation that had sustained the relationship between God and Israel for centuries had reached its fulfillment. The death of Jesus was not the end of a story, it was the opening of a new era. But the priests who had witnessed the tearing of the veil that Friday were not thinking in terms of a new era. They were thinking in terms of crisis, of danger, of institutional urgency. And the Sabbath, with all its force of restriction and silence, held them still with that thought. For the disciples of Jesus, that Sabbath was unmapped territory. They had left everything to follow him. Peter had abandoned his nets by the Sea of Galilee. Matthew had left his tax booth. All of them had staked their identity, their future, their understanding of the world on the person of that Galilean rabbi who spoke with an authority no other teacher possessed, who healed the sick, multiplied bread, walked on water, raised the dead. And now that rabbi was dead. The one who had said, "I am the resurrection and the life," was in a tomb. The one who had promised to rebuild the temple in 3 days was now a body sealed behind a stone. His words about the Son of Man being handed over to the Gentiles, crucified, and rising again on the 3rd day, words he had spoken with complete clarity on at least 3 different occasions according to the Gospels, had not penetrated the understanding of his followers in the way he had spoken them. Because the category of a crucified Messiah did not exist in first-century Judaism. The expected Messiah was a victorious king, an anointed one from the line of David who would restore the throne and free Israel from foreign domination. A crucified Messiah was, in the terms of the time, a contradiction in itself. Crucifixion was the death reserved for slaves and rebels, the most dishonorable death in the Roman system, designed precisely to strip away any claim to dignity or authority from the one who suffered it. And the book of Deuteronomy added an even darker dimension for the Jewish listener. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. Deuteronomy 21 verse 23. How could the promised Messiah be someone who had died under that curse? That question filled the disciples' Sabbath with a darkness that seemed to have no visible bottom. The Gospel of John gives a particularly intimate window into the state of the disciples when it records that they were gathered with the doors locked for fear of the authorities. John 20 verse 19. Although that reference technically belongs to the day of the resurrection, the same atmosphere of fear and confinement already surrounded the Sabbath. The temple authorities had achieved what they wanted. The troublesome Galilean was dead, but they had reason to fear that his followers might attempt to fabricate a resurrection by stealing the body and claiming that his prophecies had been fulfilled. The Gospel of Matthew records that the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate on that very Sabbath with an extraordinary request. A request that in itself reveals how closely they had listened to Jesus' teachings, even as they rejected them. "Sir, we remember that while he was still alive that deceiver said, After 3 days I will rise again. Therefore, command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away and say to the people, He has risen from the dead. And the last deception will be worse than the first. Matthew 27 verses 63 to 64. Pilate, weary of the entire Galilean affair, agreed and sent guards to the tomb. And so, while the disciples were shut in by fear, their enemies were active, sealing the tomb, setting a guard, taking precautions against a possibility they themselves described as absurd, yet one that clearly disturbed their rest. There is something profoundly significant in the fact that the adversaries of Jesus took his words about resurrection more seriously in that moment than his own followers did. The priests and Pharisees had heard those teachings and stored them as a threat to be managed. The disciples had heard them and forgotten them, unable to process them, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just lived through. The most honest explanation is that the trauma of the arrest, the night trial, Peter's denial, the flight of all the others, and finally the execution had crushed any capacity to remember and connect the promises with the present moment. Pain works like that. It closes the corridors of memory, darkens the promises of the past, reduces the horizon to the immediate experience of suffering. And that Sabbath was exactly that for the followers of Jesus. A Sabbath of total darkness, of unremembered promises, of hope seemingly buried along with the teacher. But what exactly were the disciples doing during that Sabbath? The Gospel texts maintain an almost complete silence about the content of that day, and that silence is itself eloquent. There are no speeches, no recorded discussions, no accounts of what was said or thought within the walls of the upper room, only the silence of the Sabbath resting over the grief of the disciples. And yet, it is possible to reconstruct with historical accuracy what that Sabbath implied in practical terms for devout Jewish people in Jerusalem in the year 33. The Sabbath of Passover, or the Sabbath that fell within the week of unleavened bread, was doubly solemn. It was the 7th day of the week according to the divine order, and at the same time one of the special days of the Passover festival, what the Hebrew texts refer to as a great Sabbath. Although scholars debate the precise details of that designation in relation to that specific year, the Gospel of John, with its characteristic attention to the details of the Jewish calendar, simply calls it the great day of that feast. John 19 verse 31. The author of Hebrews writes that Christ, after offering a single sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. But Christ, having offered once for all a single sacrifice for sins, sat down at the right hand of God, from that time waiting until his enemies are made a footstool for his feet. Hebrews 10 verses 12 to 13. The language of sitting is theologically significant. In the Levitical system of the temple, the priests never sat down. There were no seats in the court where they ministered, because the work of atonement was never finished, because the same sacrifices had to be repeated again and again, day after day, year after year, none of them able to achieve the definitive cleansing of sin. But Christ, after his one and sufficient sacrifice, sat down because the work was finished. He himself had said it from the cross with the word recorded in the Gospel of John, "It is finished." John 19 verse 30. The Greek term used is tetelestai, a word that in the commercial world of that time was stamped on debt documents when the debt had been fully paid. Nothing remains to be added, nothing needs to be completed. The sacrifice has been offered once, perfectly, definitively, eternally. And yet, on that Sabbath, that truth could not yet be seen or celebrated. It was buried along with the body of Jesus. The fulfillment had taken place, but the revelation of that fulfillment was still waiting. In that, there is an image of something believers in every age know well. The period between promise and visible fulfillment, between the finished work of God and the understanding the believer comes to have of that work. There are seasons in the life of faith that are like sacred Sabbaths, days of silence laid over a pain that does not understand what God is doing. Times of waiting between a loss that seems final and a resurrection that has not yet dawned. The disciples on that Sabbath were not being abandoned by God. They were being carried through a process that was moving toward something beyond anything they could imagine. But from within that Sabbath, that was impossible to see. The Gospel of Luke offers a passage that, although it technically belongs to the day of the resurrection, captures with remarkable accuracy the state of mind that had filled that Sabbath for the disciples. It is the account of the road to Emmaus, where two disciples traveling away from Jerusalem on Sunday afternoon spoke about everything that had happened with a stranger who turned out to be the risen Jesus himself. When that stranger asked what they were discussing, one of them, named Cleopas, answered with words that perfectly summarized the Sabbath they had just lived through. Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Luke 24 verses 19 to 21. We had hoped. In that past tense is contained the entire Holy Sabbath, hope placed in the past. What they had hoped for had been crushed by what seemed to be the final evidence of the cross. That is, the psychology of the Sabbath between the cross and the resurrection. There is a historical detail about Jerusalem in that time that adds another dimension to that particular Sabbath. The city Jesus knew was not the Jerusalem later destroyed and rebuilt. It was the Jerusalem that Herod the Great had transformed in the preceding decades into one of the most impressive cities of the Roman world. The temple he rebuilt and expanded was one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, with massive limestone blocks of colossal size, with porticos and marble colonnades, with the brilliance of gold and white stone that made pilgrims arriving from afar catch their breath as they saw it from the surrounding hills. The temple platform that Herod constructed over a system of arches and vaults to level the summit of Mount Moriah measured roughly 480 meters from north to south and 280 meters from east to west, covering an area that would have impressed even the most ambitious builders of the Roman Empire. Upon that platform rose the sanctuary itself, covered with sheets of gold that shone in the morning sun with such intensity that, according to accounts of the time, it could be seen from miles away. The disciples of Jesus themselves, in one of their final walks through the city before everything unfolded, had pointed out those buildings with admiration, and Jesus had responded with words that must have shaken them. "Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left upon another that will not be thrown down." Matthew 24 verse 2. That prophecy, which would be fulfilled 37 years later when the Roman legions destroyed the temple in the year 70 of our era, was part of the broader prophetic tapestry within which the ministry of Jesus was unfolding. But on that Sabbath, the architectural grandeur of the temple still stood intact, its columns casting long shadows in the afternoon light, its priests moving through its courts with the precision of a system that had functioned for centuries. And yet, the inner veil had already been torn. The mediating function of the temple had been fulfilled and surpassed. The Shekinah, the presence of God, no longer resided between the cherubim of the mercy seat in the same way it had since the days of Moses. Something had shifted in the spiritual order of the universe. But that shift was not yet visible to human eyes. Only a faith that looked back from the resurrection would be able to see what had happened on that Friday and what that silent Sabbath truly meant. The city of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus was also a place of extraordinary social and cultural density, a crossroads where Second Temple Judaism, in all its richness and internal diversity, coexisted with the Roman presence of occupation, with travelers from the Hellenistic world, with merchants from Arabia, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. The permanent population of the city was predominantly Jewish, but its composition was far from uniform. Priestly families of ancient lineage lived in the upper district of the city, in multi-story houses with ritual baths carved into the rock. Artisans and merchants filled the lower quarters, working in the bazaars that lined the main street. Pilgrims arrived from the diaspora carrying their diverse accents, the Greek of Alexandria, the Aramaic of Babylon, the liturgical Hebrew shared in the temple but rarely spoken in the streets. Scribes and Pharisees, with their phylacteries and long fringes, debated in the temple porticos the details of the oral law that complemented the written law. The Sadducees, fewer in number but greater in power, controlled the priesthood and cooperated with Rome in the delicate balance that preserved the religious autonomy of the people under imperial domination. And above all of this, quite literally above it from the Antonia fortress overlooking the northwest corner of the temple complex, Roman soldiers stood watch over the crowds of pilgrims with that mixture of professional indifference and cautious vigilance that defined Roman policy in the eastern provinces. On that Sabbath, the Roman soldiers stationed in Jerusalem had an unusual additional assignment: guarding a tomb in the garden of a man named Joseph of Arimathea, at the request of the Jewish religious leaders and with the authorization of the Roman prefect. For them, it was simply another duty, perhaps a more puzzling one than most, but a duty nonetheless. They did not know the prophecies, They had not listened to the teachings of the Galilean. They had no framework for the fears that troubled the priests. They were soldiers of an empire that had spread its power across the Mediterranean world through the force of its legions and the efficiency of its administration, and their relationship to the gods of the provinces they occupied was pragmatic and distant. The dead man in the tomb they guarded was, to them, just another executed Jew, one more outcome produced by the machinery of imperial order. That the tomb they watched was about to become the stage of the most decisive event in human history was something entirely invisible to their eyes. While all of this unfolded in the visible, human dimension of that Sabbath, what was happening in the unseen realm? Christian theology has reflected for centuries on the question of what took place with Jesus between his death on Friday and his resurrection on Sunday. The Apostle Peter, in his first letter, makes a statement that has generated generations of reflection, in which also he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison. 1 Peter 3 verse 19. The interpretation of that verse has been debated throughout the entire history of the Church, ranging from the proclamation of Christ's victory over the powers of evil to the idea of his presence among the righteous of old who awaited redemption. The Apostles' Creed, one of the earliest summaries of Christian faith, includes the phrase, "He descended into the depths," reflecting the conviction that the work of Christ was not confined to the earthly realm but extended into every dimension of existence. What that Sabbath meant in the invisible realms surpasses the limits of human language. But the silence on earth that day did not reflect silence in heaven. The Father who had sent the Son, who had not intervened to stop the crucifixion because that very surrender was the heart of the eternal plan of redemption, that Father was neither absent nor distant. The work the Son had accomplished on the cross was being received in heaven with a glory the earth could not yet perceive. The Passover feast that surrounded that Sabbath held at its center a pattern that the generation of Jesus' disciples had known since childhood, yet one that only the resurrection would unveil in its full depth. When God delivered Israel from Egypt, the central instrument of that deliverance was the blood of the Passover lamb. The instructions in the book of Exodus are precise in their symbolism: a lamb without blemish, a male of the first year, kept until the 14th day of the month, and then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel would slaughter it at twilight. Exodus 12 verse 6. The blood was to be applied to the doorposts and the lintel of each house. When the Lord saw the blood, he would pass over. That night of blood, that night of deliverance, established the sacred calendar of Israel. The month of Nisan, the month of the Exodus, was set as the first month of the year. Passover would be celebrated forever as the foundational event of Israel's identity, the moment when God demonstrated that he was both able and willing to intervene in history with sovereign power to rescue his people from slavery. And so, on that 14th of Nisan in the year 33 of our era, the spotless lamb was sacrificed, not in the temple courts alongside thousands of others, but on a hill outside the walls, on the wood of a Roman cross, between the 3rd hour and the 9th hour of the day, from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, precisely the period when the priests slaughtered the Passover lambs in the temple. The alignment of the calendar was not accidental. The Apostle Paul, trained in the rabbinic tradition, would have understood the weight of that moment when he wrote that Christ was sacrificed for us. Passover no longer commemorated only the deliverance from Egypt. Through all those centuries of lambs and blood and marked doorposts, it had been pointing forward to this single final sacrifice. And the Sabbath that followed that day of sacrifice was, in that sense, the Sabbath of a new Passover. The blood had already been shed, the deliverance had already been secured. What remained was for the world to know it. The psalm sung by the Levites in the temple that Sabbath carried an irony that only the resurrection would fully reveal. Psalm 92, the Psalm of the Sabbath, celebrates the righteousness of God and the downfall of the wicked, and it ends with an image of flourishing that resonates with striking power in this context. The righteous shall flourish like the palm tree, he shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Planted in the house of the Lord, they shall flourish in the courts of our God. They shall still bear fruit in old age, they shall be full of sap and green. Psalm 92 verse 12. In the temple where the veil had already been torn, where the sacrificial system of mediation had reached its completion, the Levites were singing about the flourishing of the righteous. They could not know that the righteous one who had been handed over to death the day before was about to flourish in a way that surpassed every image of palm or cedar, that the life sown in that tomb would rise on Sunday morning with a power no force in the universe could contain. Death did not have the final word. The Sabbath was not the end. It was the eve of the first day of a new creation, just as the prophet had declared, not once but again and again, with variations that illuminated one another across the centuries. The prophet Isaiah, writing more than 700 years before that Sabbath, had described the suffering servant with a precision that only the cross could fully reveal. He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Isaiah 53 verse 5. That passage, debated by rabbis in terms of collective or individual meaning, some applying it to the nation of Israel, others to a future messianic figure, found its definitive expression in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, given over to death the day before that Sabbath. Psalm 22, which Jesus quoted from the cross with his opening words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27 verse 46, was a psalm David had written in his own suffering, yet it contained images that described crucifixion with a precision no author of the 10th century before Christ could have known firsthand. "They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing." Psalm 22 verses 16 to 18. The Roman soldiers had cast lots for Jesus' tunic at the foot of the cross. That was not coincidence. It was the fulfillment of a word that had waited 1,000 years to find its moment of truth. Have you ever found yourself in a holy Sabbath of your own life? In that space between a Friday of loss and a Sunday of resurrection that has not yet arrived, where the promises of God feel distant and the pain of the present overwhelms your ability to remember them? If so, share what you are going through, because perhaps the story of that Sabbath in Jerusalem has something specific to say to you today. Because that Sabbath, seen from the distance of 2,000 years, was not the end of anything. It was the center of everything. It was the exact point between promise fulfilled and promise revealed. It was the moment when the universe held its breath before the most important morning in its history. And those who lived it from the inside, the disciples locked away in fear, the women waiting with their spices, the priests with their torn veil and sacrifices that were no longer what they believed them to be, none of them could see what that Sabbath truly was. They could only live through the darkness and wait for dawn. There is a lesson in that which transcends its historical setting and speaks directly to the life of any believer in any century. The Apostle Paul would express it decades later with words that may be the purest distillation of the message. "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one may boast." Ephesians 2 verses 8 to 9. That grace did not depend on the disciples understanding what was happening. It did not depend on their courage holding firm or their faith remaining strong. It depended solely on what the Son of God had accomplished on the cross, something sufficient, complete, and eternal. Salvation was not in the process of negotiation on that Sabbath. It was already finished. The declaration from the cross was final, and yet the immediate recipients of that salvation were, at that very moment, hidden behind closed doors, weeping without understanding. Grace operates independently of human comprehension. That is its nature. That is its greatness. To fully understand that Sabbath, one must also consider the figure of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and what that day meant for her in particular. The Gospels do not tell us where Mary was that Sabbath, nor what she did or thought, but the tradition of the Church and the logic of the narrative suggest that she was in the care of John, the beloved disciple, to whom Jesus had entrusted her from the cross with his final act of filial love. "Woman, behold your son, behold your mother." John 19 verses 26 to 27. It was the gesture of a dying son concerned for his mother even in the midst of his own agony. And now that son was dead, and Mary was living in John's home. There may be no more silent Sabbath in all of human history than the one lived by that woman who had received the angel's announcement, who had conceived by the Holy Spirit, who had sung her song of praise, who had kept all these things in her heart since the birth of her son in Bethlehem, 33 years leading to this Sabbath of silence, with her son's body in a sealed tomb and her tears directed only toward the God who had sent him. The prophecy of Simeon in the temple, spoken when Jesus was a child of 40 days, had told her that a sword would pierce her own soul. That Sabbath was the sword. And yet, there is a tradition of spiritual reflection that points to something extraordinary in Mary's faith during that day. While everyone else had lost visible hope, She, perhaps more than anyone, had reason to trust that God had not finished his work. She knew the origin of the Son in a way no one else did. She had received the promise from the angel, "The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end."
Luke 1 verses 32 to 33.
There was no expiration date on that promise. There was no condition that the crucifixion could cancel. Perhaps in the silence of that Sabbath, Mary turned those words over within herself, like someone retracing a familiar path, searching for an exit that must exist but is not yet visible. Perhaps that Sabbath was for Mary not only the Sabbath of the sword, but also the Sabbath of the purest faith, the kind of faith that does not need to see because it trusts the one who promised. The Temple of Jerusalem, with all its architectural magnificence and its elaborate system of worship, had been built upon Mount Moriah, the very place where Abraham had once come to offer his son Isaac in obedience to God's command. The book of Genesis recounts that event with a narrative simplicity that itself reflects the economy of God, everything necessary, and nothing more. Abraham took Isaac, his only son, the son of promise, the one he had waited 100 years to receive, and went up the mountain with the wood, the fire, and the knife. Isaac, carrying the wood on his own shoulders, asked his father where the lamb for the offering was. And Abraham answered with words that stand as one of the quietest prophecies in all of Scripture, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the offering, my son."
Genesis 22 verse 8.
That answer was at once a declaration of Abraham's faith about the immediate moment and a prophecy reaching far into the future, one that even Abraham himself could not have fully understood. On Mount Moriah, God provided a ram caught by its horns in a thicket as a substitute for Isaac. But that provision pointed forward through the centuries to the only Son of God, who would ascend that same mountain bearing his own cross, the wood of the offering, and who would not be stopped by any angel, because he himself was the Lamb God had provided from before the foundation of the world. That Sabbath, in the garden near Golgotha, the Lamb provided by God from eternity rested in the tomb. The sacrifice was complete, the debt was paid, the veil was torn, the stone was sealed over the entrance by men who did not know they were sealing their own defeat. The full weight of that Sabbath, its silence, its darkness, its apparent desolation, was the weight of a finished work waiting to be revealed, like a seed in the ground that shows nothing to the observer above, yet within itself carries the full power of the life about to emerge. Jesus himself had used that image in the days before his death when he spoke of a grain of wheat falling into the earth. Unless it dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. John 12 verse 24. That Sabbath was the day of the seed in the soil, the hidden life, the fruit not yet visible. The inhabitants of Jerusalem who knew nothing of Jesus, or had only heard of him in passing, the merchant on the other side of the city, the pilgrim from Babylon who had completed his Passover observances and was resting in the house of his host, the lower-ranking priest carrying out his duties without having taken part in the trial of the Galilean, all of them experienced that Sabbath as an ordinary Passover Sabbath. The restrictions of rest, the family meals, the psalms, the prayers. Nothing on the surface of the city indicated that the axis of history had shifted the day before. Nothing visible distinguished that Sabbath from the hundreds that had come before it in the holy city. And yet, it was the most different Sabbath that had ever existed. Because before that Sabbath, the final sacrifice had not yet been offered. Before that Sabbath, the way into the most holy place of God's presence had not been opened. Before that Sabbath, death still held the final word over all the children of Adam, and now it no longer did. The Apostle John, writing decades later from the depth of a lifetime spent reflecting on what he had seen and lived, found the simplest and most absolute words to describe the meaning of it all. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life.
John 3 verse 16.
The love John describes was not a love confined to a single day. It was the eternal love that moved through the Friday of the cross, the Saturday of silence, and the Sunday of resurrection, like a thread passing through the beads of a necklace, giving them unity and form. That love had been placed in a tomb that Sabbath along with the body of the Son. And that love would be what emerged from that tomb on the morning of the first day of the week. Transformed, glorified, irreversible, eternal. The city of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus had a geography that gave physical shape to the theological order governing the life of its people. At the center stood the temple on Mount Moriah. Around it stretched the upper city and the lower city, divided by the Tyropoeon Valley, which in later times would be buried beneath layers of debris, but which in the first century still marked a visible distinction between the wealthier western districts and the more modest eastern ones. The upper city, to the west of the valley, was inhabited mainly by priestly and aristocratic families, with multi-story houses, mosaic floors, imported fine tableware, and stone ritual baths uncovered by modern archaeology. The lower city, on the slope facing the Mount of Olives, was the Jerusalem of craftsmen, merchants, and pilgrims, with narrower streets and simpler buildings, yet filled with the same religious vitality that permeated the entire city during feast days. The upper room where Jesus had shared the final meal with his disciples on Thursday night was somewhere in that upper district, in a house whose owner had made it available for the observance of Passover. And it was somewhere in that same district, or perhaps in the lower one, that the disciples remained hidden that Sabbath. The Mount of Olives, to the east of the city, separated from it by the Kidron Valley, had been the setting for many decisive moments in the days just before. From its slopes one could see the temple and the entire city spread out below, a view that during the feast, when the smoke of sacrifices rose from the altar and the songs of the Levites filled the air, must have been among the most striking sights in the ancient world. Jesus had spent the nights of that week on the Mount of Olives, or in the village of Bethany beyond its ridge. Returning each morning to the city to teach in the temple, he had wept over Jerusalem from that mount, saying, "If you, even you, had known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes."
Luke 19 verse 42.
Those words, spoken days before the crucifixion, echoed differently on that silent Sabbath. What was meant for her peace had passed before her eyes, and she had not recognized it. And now the one who had wept over the city was dead. And the city continued to live its Sabbath without understanding what it had lost or what it was about to receive. Gethsemane, the garden at the foot of the Mount of Olives where Jesus had spent the hours before his arrest in agonizing prayer, was a place of mature olive trees where oil was pressed. The very name, Gethsemane in Hebrew, means oil press. The image is theologically dense. The place where oil was extracted under crushing pressure was the place where the Son of God was pressed under the weight of what he was about to bear. Oil in the biblical tradition is the symbol of anointing, of the Spirit, of the Anointed One. The Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, was pressed in Gethsemane and anointed through his own suffering for the work he was about to accomplish. That garden, on that Friday, had been the scene of his arrest. On that Sabbath, it rested in silence, the ground still bearing the marks of soldiers' sandals and the memory of sweat like drops of blood falling to the earth in the agony of prayer. There is something in the geography of that week in Jerusalem that speaks of a narrative coherence no human being could have orchestrated. The same mountain where Abraham had brought Isaac for sacrifice. The same mountain where Solomon had built the temple. The same mountain where the high priest offered the atoning sacrifice year after year. That mountain witnessed the final fulfillment of everything those events had foreshadowed. The history of Israel was not an arbitrary accumulation of religious moments. It was a single story with a single arc pointing to this precise moment. The hill of Golgotha, the cross, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And the Sabbath that followed that fulfillment was the Sabbath of the world itself, holding its breath between the work accomplished and the work revealed. Psalm 16, which the Apostle Peter would later quote in his sermon at Pentecost weeks after the resurrection, contains words that carry a particular weight in this context. "For you will not abandon my soul to the grave, nor will you allow your Holy One to see decay."
Psalm 16 verse 10.
Peter would argue before the people of Jerusalem that David could not have been speaking of himself in that psalm, because David had died and his tomb was still among them. David was speaking under the inspiration of the Spirit about the one whom God had promised to place on his throne. He was speaking of the Christ who would be killed, yet not abandoned to the grave, nor left to decay. That psalm, sung in the temple and in synagogues through the centuries, was a promise of resurrection written in the poetic language of a king. And on that Sabbath in Jerusalem, that promise was only hours away from its visible fulfillment. The question that this Sabbath raises for believers of every generation is not merely historical, nor only theological, it is deeply personal. What do you do with your own silent Sabbaths? With those times between the promise you received and the fulfillment you have not yet seen? How do you keep the command when your heart is broken? How do you rest in God when everything in you wants to move, to act, to fix, to search for an exit? The women who rested according to the commandment did not know they were only hours away from the morning that would change everything. They only knew that the commandment was the commandment, and that God was still God, even when all they could see was a sealed tomb. That kind of faith, blind faith, obedience without sight, faithfulness in the dark, is at the very heart of the spiritual journey in its most difficult moments. The writer of the letter to the Hebrews, speaking of the rest God has prepared for his people, makes a connection that sheds unexpected light on that Sabbath. There remains, then, a rest for the people of God, for whoever enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Hebrews 4 verses 9 to 10. The rest spoken of there is not merely the weekly Sabbath, though that Sabbath is its symbol and shadow. It is the rest that comes from trusting completely in the finished work of Christ, from ceasing to strive to earn what has already been given, from entering the peace of one who knows the debt has been paid and nothing remains to be added. That Sabbath in Jerusalem was the Sabbath in which the debt was paid. The declaration from the cross echoed over the city, even if no one could yet hear it clearly. The ultimate rest had been secured. Only the morning of Sunday remained to reveal it. The archaeology of Jerusalem has, in recent decades, uncovered details that give texture and substance to what the Gospel accounts describe from that time. Excavations in the Jewish quarter of the Old City, carried out after the reunification of Jerusalem in 1967, revealed the remains of houses from the Second Temple period with extraordinary preservation. Mosaic floors, wall frescoes, large stone vessels used for ritual purification, stone tables, terracotta dishes, ritual baths carved into the living rock beneath the homes of priests and people of status, evidence of the intense concern for ritual purity that permeated every dimension of life in first century Jerusalem. That material city, with its stones and mosaics and vessels, was the physical stage upon which that Sabbath unfolded. It was not an abstract setting of sacred text. It was a real city, with sounds and smells and textures, with the Mediterranean breeze carrying cool air over the hills of Judea, with the scent of olive trees and blossoming almonds in the gardens at the foot of the walls. In that real city, on that real Sabbath, the real God of Israel was carrying out the most real work in all of history. The prophet Hosea, writing in the 6th century before Christ, spoke words that the rabbinic tradition would later apply to the national restoration of Israel, yet which, in the context of that Passover in the year 33, took on a meaning that surpassed any collective interpretation. Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us, that he may heal us. He has struck us down, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will raise us up, that we may live in his presence. On the 3rd day he will raise us up, and we shall live before him. Hosea 6. The 3rd day. That expression appears throughout the Old Testament in a variety of contexts that rabbinic interpreters had long noticed. The 3rd day of creation, when dry land and vegetation appeared. The 3rd day of Abraham's journey to Mount Moriah. The 3rd day of the revelation at Sinai. There was something about the 3rd day in the economy of God that repeatedly pointed toward divine intervention after apparent silence, after apparent death. That Sabbath was the 2nd day. The 3rd day was Sunday. There is an image the early church fathers used to describe the period between death and resurrection, one with striking visual power. They described that Sabbath as the day when the Lord of the Sabbath rested on the Sabbath. The one who had established the rest of the 7th day, the one who had declared, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath," rested in the tomb on that 7th day. It was the last Sabbath of the old order. The first day of the week that followed would be the first day of a new creation. The Sabbath of the original creation had been the day when God rested from his work of creation. This Sabbath was the day when the Son rested from his work of redemption. And just as the first creation had been followed by the presence and movement of God in the garden in the cool of the day, this new creation would be inaugurated by the presence and movement of the risen Christ in the garden where the tomb was, at the dawn of the first day of the week.